now to introduce our first session. The topic is very interesting. Water is thicker than blood. Family crisis and the household of God. And we are grateful that we have Rev Dr Bernard Wong as our presenter for this particular session. And we would like actually to congratulate Dr. Bernard Wong because he was just installed as president of the China Graduate School of Theology last week. I told him congratulations, but may God have mercy on you also. Because it's not easy to be a president of a seminary, especially at this time. And he has been there actually serving as professor in CGST in Hong Kong for many years. Now, his research interests include sexuality, gender, and the family, bioethics, faith and technology, and creation care. Now, Dr. Bernard Wong is the author of Beginning from Man and Woman, Witnessing Christ's Love in the Family, it's in English, and Communio, a biblical reflection on relationship and community, which is in Chinese. And he is also the co-editor of the upcoming Asian Christian Ethics, Evangelical Perspectives, that will be released by Langham and ATA, hopefully very soon. So now we would like to give him the time to share his presentation. This will be in 2 parts. So after the first part, you will have an opportunity to engage with him. You can ask questions. Those of us in the Zoom, you can put your questions in the discussion chat group. Also, those who are watching in FB Live, you can just post your question and somebody will be sharing that to our speaker. So after the first part, we'll read a few questions and then we'll go over the second part and then we'll have a longer time for Q&A after that. Now, for those of you who are in the Zoom, later you will have opportunity to join the breakout room, which will give you time to share also your insights and to engage with other participants. For those who are in FB Live, sorry that you will not be able to join them. But if you are also willing to engage, you can just still catch up and join us instead. Okay, Dr. Bernard, I'll give the floor to you now, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
So, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. And actually, I have recorded my talk. And I find that it's easy to control the time. And so I guess we'll just begin by listening to what I have recorded, and then I welcome to discuss with all the participants here afterwards. And as Theresa just mentioned, the first part will be about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion, and then followed by the second part. And I really look forward to discussing the issue with all of you. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Theological Consultation. The title of my talk is Water is Thicker Than Blood, Family Crisis and the Household of God. I will first say something about what is family crisis and the church and how the church responds to it. Then I'll give my opinion on what moral imagination we can give to Asian societies so that the family crisis can be addressed. Let me begin. Don Browning, an American practical theologian, used the term family crisis to describe the situation of the family in USA during the latter half of the 20th century. This crisis was caused by the breakdown of the intact family, a family unit made up of the married couple with their biological children, all living under the same roof. Often we call intact family the nuclear family, but the name intact implies that any other familial arrangement is less than ideal or even harmful, especially for children. Browning's concern was actually the well-being of children who grew up with single parents, often single mothers. Sociological studies showed that children from intact families fare better in academics and career performance. Children from broken families were also less healthy and more prone to committing crime, thereby burdening the society as a whole. So the family crisis not only affects personal well-being, but is also a public welfare concern. If we define family crisis as societies deviating from the norm of intact family where people enter lifelong marriage to raise their biological children together, Asian countries also followed USA's trend of declining health of the intact family. Now, remaining unmarried for life, cohabitation, divorce, remarriage, single parenthood, blended families, and marriages with no children are becoming more common in this part of the world since the 1970s. Homosexuality is also gradually gaining acceptance in many Asian cultures. Evangelical churches emphasize the importance of the stable heterosexual family. According to the Bible, marriage is defined as the one flesh union between a man and a woman. Lifelong and stable marriage is considered the foundation of a good family for the benefit of the couple and their children. As the stable family is on decline, the church responds by protecting the sanctity of marriage. Homosexuality and divorce are fervently addressed and opposed. While homosexuality attempts to redefine the heterosexual nature of marriage union, divorce and remarriage addresses the stability of this union. Besides, marriage between believers and non-believers is frowned upon as it may lead to more divorces. All these teachings aim to encourage the stable marriage and the intact family. The Evangelical Church is constantly seeking theological and moral resources to cultivate family stability. Our desire for family stability may make us nostalgic about the traditional Asian families. In the past, Asian cultures did foster very stable families. Divorces or parents abandoning their children were rare. We are now tempted to wish for a return to the past, such that the current family crisis could be solved. However, we must understand that many traditional Asian cultures, though producing ultra-stable families, are in disagreement with Christian values in many aspects. I would like to use the traditional Chinese family as an example. Patriarchal culture developed as Chinese people began to transition from nomadic tribes and settled down as farmers. For farming societies, the accumulation of land and property over generations became important, and societies must develop a system of inheritance to serve this need. The patriarchal and patrilineal system arose to meet this purpose. But the narrative was needed to make sense of the system. The narrative takes this form. The most important task for a family is to sustain and pass on the qi, or the breath, of the family. Only the male is endowed with this qi, so a male must pass on the qi by fathering a son for the family to continue.
While females do not carry any chi, they should offer pao, or the placenta, for the service of her husband. This narrative gives the firstborn son, the main carrier of the family chi, ownership of the family property and authority over other family members. But to maintain this authority, he must obtain a male heir. As female does not carry any chi, she does not share her father's breath, and she must marry another man and get pregnant with his son to carry her husband's chi. So, a woman never belongs to her family of origin and only finds her own family by marrying into her husband's family. It is therefore natural for her family of origin to so-called get rid of her as early as possible. But when she is married, she then becomes a container of her husband's chi and only become worthy by giving birth to male heirs. The imperative to pass on the family chi means that both male and female must marry and give birth to at least one son. It is thus shameful for a person to remain single or to have no son of his or her own, and it is honorable to have many sons and grandsons. Wives who fail to bear a son brings shame to her family and may be divorced, thereby losing the means to livelihood. It is also reasonable for wealthy men to take multiple wives to increase their chance of begetting male heirs. Male promiscuity is often condoned as a result. On the other hand, female promiscuity brings dire risk to her husband's family by allowing another man's chi to intrude into his family. And the penalty of such an offense can be death by drowning. Wives who are faithful to their husbands are given great honor, especially widows who choose to remain unmarried or chaste for life. But without a husband's support, the livelihood of a widow can be difficult. The traditional Chinese patriarchal family, the honor-shame system, and the glorification of female chastity has ensured ultra-stable marriages for centuries. However, this traditional culture can be malicious to women, causing much injustice and harm. Modern Chinese Christian ethicists frequently use the Bible to criticize their own patriarchal culture. They notice that the traditional Chinese society was rather similar to the Old Testament Jewish society in causing injustice to women. While a Jewish man could divorce his wife if she displeased him, from Deuteronomy 24:1, a Chinese husband could do the same for any 7 reasons, such as infertility, unwillingness to serve his relatives, gossiping, jealousy, or sickness. Therefore, Jesus' critique of the Jews, "hearts were hard," is equally applicable to the Chinese. Reference Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. In addition, polygamy and concubinage were widely practiced in ancient cultures that have not been transformed by Christianity, Jewish and Chinese included. Gender inequality was also severe, as only husbands could put off their wives, but not the other way around. While the livelihood of women depended totally on their husbands, divorced women found it difficult to survive. These traditional marriage and family norms caused much harm and injustice to women, and should be criticized and transformed by Christianity. The Chinese society, in fact, began to change in the late 19th century, and Christianity did play a part in it. Historians attribute this change to two main factors. The first one, the exposure of Chinese to Western ideas through trade, and secondly, the evangelical, educational, charitable, and publishing works done by Western missionaries. The early missionaries into China first sowed the seeds of women liberation, not only by speaking highly of women, but also by opening schools and orphanages for girls. Chinese reformists of the early 20th century, many of them non-Christians, followed the footsteps of these missionaries to continue the women's liberation movement. The evil behind the traditional patriarchal family was continually exposed and criticized, and Chinese society became more and more open to women's rights and gender equality. Women's liberation continues today, and the economic and political status of women has greatly improved. Well, but as the status of women rose, so did the rate of divorce. This is the unfortunate reality all societies have to face, not just Chinese. Under the influence of the liberation movement, old systems of marriage and family were dismantled, and the liberation from bondage was exalted as the only ideal. In the 20th century, humanism and companionship marriage stepped in to fill the moral void. The basis of marriage stability shifted from familial obligations and economic needs to romantic love. But as romantic love and feelings may change over time, the rate of divorce rose everywhere in the world. This is the context where Asian Christians navigate the issue of divorce and remarriage today. On the one hand, challenging patriarchy and empowering women alleviates injustice. But on the other hand, the same social change results in more divorce. Christians must also know that missionaries did play a part in challenging patriarchy, though no Christian would celebrate the unfortunate rise in divorce that follows. Nevertheless, to address the issue of divorce and remarriage today, the Church must avoid advocating a return to traditional patriarchy. Moreover, given the changing culture, appealing to ethical rules alone may not be adequate. A moral vision of the family is needed.
So this is the first part of my talk, and perhaps we can have some discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have. Thank you for such an insightful talk and very incisive. Let us pause for a while just to ask questions. And I also want to encourage any of you who have questions, just type it on the Q&A or on the comments box in Facebook. But here's my question. To address the issue of family crisis, you mentioned that we avoid returning to traditional patriarchy. But my question is, are there areas in traditional patriarchy that could align with biblical principles that perhaps could be adopted?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. We see that the traditional patriarchy actually, ensures the family was very stable. We seldom hear about divorce, and so what we can say is that patriarchy is actually a a way of life that encourages stable and orderly family, right? But of course, I talked about the ills, the harms that arose. So I would say the problem with patriarchy is actually the disparagement of women and also making men too powerful. So that creates the inequality. But I would say what is important for patriarchy, traditional patriarchy, is the emphasis of some sort of a stable order. I would say, for example, in China, in Chinese culture, we continue to have children whose last name following their father instead of the mother, right? And people accept it. I don't think there's any harm that is done to it, right? But in the tradition, only the son can inherit the property.
Oh.
That may be a problem, right? So we can revisit whether we should continue the tradition of only allowing the son to inherit or only allowing the son to have education, right? So we should address that. But the culture of naming children following the father's last name and so there are things in Chinese culture. It's like we have a sense of belonging more to our father's side. I think in that sense, there's not really much of a problem. But when the patriarchy actually creates a culture where the male is privileged in terms of power, inheritance, to a degree that women is actually harmed, I think that is the patriarchy that we oppose. And the other thing is really, I will talk about that later on, but is the imperative to have children, and that is bad. But for the traditional patriarchy, which emphasizes that parents should stay together for the sake of their children, I mean, this kind of communal sense, we should maintain that. And the more Western influence of more individualistic kind of idea, I think we should be really careful when we kind of oppose patriarchy. We don't want individualism to creep in and destroy the stable family. So I think that is something I can mention to that question. Yeah.
Okay, now related to that is the question, is the Chinese patriarchal family system redeemable?
Yes, I would say. I mean, it's really to do with terminology. You see, I mean, if you really hate the word patriarchy, I would say no. But you see, I even though I say that I'm against traditional patriarchy, I think that there is difference between the male and the female. We can have different roles. God specifies that it's the woman who gives birth to children. We are not going to change that, right? So there are definite roles which kind of sort of a patriarchy would reflect or reflect. And so what I think is really, if you really don't like the word, but there is some sort of sometimes people say that, well, we should keep the paternal culture. Paternity is good. I mean, something like that. But I would say there are some things that traditional patriarchy we can borrow from. So I would say we can redeem it. But for cultures that really, if you think that the connotation of patriarchy, the word itself is totally evil, I would say you can abandon that. But it's really down to the definition or how you like the word, how you don't like the word. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, how would you reconcile Paul's teaching on the role of women in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy 2:11-12
right,
with the patriarchy that we should oppose?
Right. And I think, well, I would say the Bible, the New Testament, is a product of the culture. itself, right? So we have to be careful, whether Paul is talking about men and women per se, ontologically. I mean, I don't support ontological difference between men and women. And I don't support, inborn authority difference between the genders, right? But I support the gender, we should have different roles, right? It's not a power difference. It's really the role difference. And of course, we have biological difference. Men and women, we may have like different psychological makeup. I would respect that. So I'm not saying that men and women are totally equal in all aspects. I'm only saying that in terms of equal dignity, yes, we should maintain that. And so I would say very simple that we have to separate the cultural element from the New Testament, from from a more kind of like ontological difference. So that is it's not easy, but but I would say I would be a little bit careful about just literally reading from the Bible and applying to today's context.
Okay, thank you so much. Just one more question. You also mentioned that we do not appeal to ethical rules. Could you just elaborate a bit on that, and then we will move on to the next section of your recording after this?
Well, I would say yes. I would not advocate rules, and actually, Jesus opposed to the Pharisees. Basically, they are turning everything, God. I would say Jesus accuses the Pharisees of turning God's commandment into stifling rules, right? But Jesus is not opposing the commandment itself, right? So I would say the way Jesus did that in the Sermon on the Mount was to tell the disciples that they were the salt and the light of the world, right? So I would say becoming the salt and the light of the world is the moral imagination that Jesus gives, right? So the moral imagination tells us who we are as individual Christians and as a community of Christians. And so being salt and light of the world doesn't give you, it's not the same as rules, but Jesus continues to explain what he means throughout the Sermon on the Mount. So I would use the same thing today. So to give us more imagination to tell us who we are, instead of giving us rules, what you should do and what you should not. But all the rules, I mean, in a particular context, I would say, yes, we have some moral rules, but that moral rule depends on the context. But the more important thing we should hold on to is the moral imagination. And I will use that as a kind of like an analogy to what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah.
Thank you. And this is a really good place to pause and to go on with the recordings, because I think Dr. Bernard Wong is going to elaborate more on the moral imagination or the moral vision that he is advocating for. So I'm going to pass this time to Alex to continue with the second part of the recording. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard.
Thank you. Yeah.
In Western Christian traditions, love is frequently invoked as the moral vision that informs interpersonal relationships, family included. Back in my PhD research, which was done in the USA, my thesis was that Christ's love offers a moral vision for Christians to navigate familial relationships. I would like to offer a very brief summary here. In my thesis, I followed the Ephesian household codes from chapter 5, verse 21 to chapter 6, verse 9. I understand the family through three pairs of relationship: husband and wife, or parents and children, a master and servant. and master and servant points to family members and their neighbors. I argued that Christ's love should inform all these relationships. As mentioned above, companionship marriage and romantic love bears the burden of maintaining stable marriages in many contemporary cultures. While romantic love can help couples form strong emotional bonds, it does, however, change over time. I suggest that Christ's love as friendship can supplement our understanding of love between husbands and wives. Friendship not only involves positive feelings towards the other, but also emphasizes mutuality, communion, and covenant. Making close friends takes time and energy, and thus a person cannot have too many of them. Therefore, to see one's husband or wife as a friend encourages them to cultivate their relationship and devote to each other with the limited time and energy they have. Although friendship between humans can weaken or even end, the friendship that Christ offers us stays on forever. Besides, Christ's friendship does not seek the self, but the well-being of the other, as well as the communion between the two. Christ's love as friendship can thus help us build stable relationships between husbands and wives. In many Asian cultures, parental authority and filial piety is frequently invoked as the moral norm that governs the relationship between parents and children. While orders in the family is maintained, traditional Asian families may lack warmth and compassion. Christ's love can make up for this lack. But as parents are more mature and capable than their young children, we need a notion of love that is between unequal persons. I suggest Christ's love in his incarnation may offer us such image. In his incarnation, Christ humbled himself to become human, taking on our same nature. In the same way, parents should always remember that they share the same humanity with their children. The purpose of Christ's incarnation is to save us. So, incarnational love aims not only on sharing the lowliness of the weak, but to empower the weak to become strong. Therefore, parents must use their higher authority not for their own benefits, but to help their children grow. Finally, incarnational love demands sacrifice, and parents should be ready to make sacrifices for their children. The Ephesian household codes include masters and servants as part of the exhortations. This reminds us that families may also include people not connected by bloodline or marriage. The unfolding love of Christ helps family members extend their love to neighbors and include them into their families. Unfolding love, having the characteristics of overflowing, reaching out, and embracing the other, reminds family members not to close in upon themselves. In fact, the transition of a person from singleness to marriage and then to parenthood is already an expression of unfolding love. A single person who dates another person must break open her narcissistic love of the self. A dating couple entering marriage must also embrace family members of each other's family of origin. The birth of a child signals the end of their exclusive relationship as a couple. Unfolding love continues to urge family members to include and embrace people unrelated by bloodline under the same roof. Taking in visitors, welcoming strangers, employing a domestic helper, and adopting a child are examples of the practice of unfolding love. While the ethics of love is emphasized in many Western cultures, it is not accentuated as much in Asia. For instance, Confucian ethics emphasizes the cultivation of a person's character in concrete communal settings. One crucial moral teaching states that a person should pursue an 8-step process of investigating things, extending knowledge, being sincere in thoughts, rectifying their hearts, cultivating their persons, regulating their families, ordering their states, and making the world peaceful. The concept of love is absent in this teaching altogether. Moreover, the collective and communal is emphasized over the individual for the maintenance of a hierarchical relational structure. Confucianism underscores a person's position in the collective, family, or states, more than her individual practice of love for others. Therefore, collective concepts may appeal more to Asians who have come under Confucian influence. The church, as a collective concept, can serve as an effective image to address the moral issues related to the family among Asian Christians. The New Testament names the church the household of God. Familial language, such as brothers and sisters and God's children, is used to describe relationships within the church. The family is a favorite metaphor that Chinese Christians use to imagine the church. A study reveals that church as family and family as church are important concepts that Chinese churches embrace in their ministries. While it is true that Confucian concepts of the family may adversely influence the church, leading to closed-off and homogeneous communities, hierarchical relationships, and paternalistic leadership. But I think that the Christian understanding of the church, or ecclesiology, can offer Asian Christians a moral vision to address the issues that the contemporary family faces. Here, I offer a very cursory description of such a moral vision based on 3 images of the church found in the Bible: the bride of Christ, the body of Christ, and the household of God. The church as the bride of Christ means that it is the eschatological community, referencing Revelations 21, verse 2. The marital image suggests that the church is a covenantal community characterized by faithfulness and love. Christians should bear witness to the total peace and reconciliation of the new heaven and new earth. Therefore, the church should resist the culture of easy divorce and help married couples to maintain faithful and family members to love one another. Peace and reconciliation, visions congenial to many Asian cultures, can supplement romantic love as a stabilizing force for marriages and families. But on the other hand, the reality that perfect peace is eschatological means that humanity is always marred by sin before Christ returns. Yahya Wijaya, an Indonesian theologian, contends that on this side of the eschaton, just as the church was unable to avoid fragmentation, so many families have been unable to resist divorce. When divorce becomes inevitable, the church should not simply condemn or avoid avoid the divorcees. As a community of reconciliation, the church should continue to accept them and help them build respectful relationships, though not as husbands and wives anymore. This is all the more valuable because divorcees, single-parent families, and blended families often need support, and the church should not neglect its duty. The church as the body of Christ means that different members are of equal dignity, but are called into different roles, receiving different gifts to serve one another for the benefit of the whole community. Reference 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Families modeled after this concept subvert the Asian patriarchal family. As Christ is the head of the household, power imbalance between husband and wife is challenged. The role of each member should be decided according to the gifts each receives. So Christian couples need not conform to the fixed gender roles stipulated in their cultures. What is important is that each member uses her gifts for the benefit of the whole family. The headship of Christ and equal dignity among members, however, does not entail equal authority between parents and children. Parenthood is a calling from God, and parents are given authority over their children to guide them toward maturity in Christ. But in turn, children should obey their parents in Christ, referencing Ephesians chapter 6, 1-4. But when a child is mature enough to leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, parents should let go of their authority. Parental authority is highly regarded in Asian cultures, so this notion can help Christian families navigate the relationship between parents and children. The church as the household of God means that all are included. Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Jesus also teaches that whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Reference Mark chapter 3, verse 35. The flesh and blood family is relativized. Unlike the adage, blood is thicker than water. The church is a community where water is thicker than blood. The water of baptism is more important than blood relationships. A person's familial role is contingent and does not define her identity. Her spiritual identity as a member of God's household is more important. Looked through this lens, a person's familial role is therefore assigned by God and should be understood as one's calling from God. Reference 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. Each person should therefore accept her own familial calling in joy and gratitude. Singleness is an equally dignified calling, as demonstrated by Jesus and Paul. Childlessness is not shameful, and every adult in the church is a spiritual parent to the children of others. This understanding of the family challenges the familialism of Asia, the idea that each person must marry and produce a male heir to continue the bloodline. Moreover, when members of God's household are not necessarily related by blood, the church can become surrogate families for those who lack economic or emotional support from their biological families. The early Christians realized that they belonged to the same family, so in Acts chapter 2 verse 44 to 45 says that all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This notion of the church is especially relevant for families having members who work or study overseas, a phenomenon that is becoming more common in Asia. The church then becomes these people's surrogate family while their family members are not around. Now, these are my preliminary ideas about how ecclesiology and the image of household of God can offer Asian Christians so we can build strong marriages and family. And I would welcome any comments and ideas, and I look forward to discussing the subject further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. I really love how you fleshed out the moral imagination and the moral vision, but it's a bit, we really need to unpack it. So
Yes.
I hope that the
Yes.
questions
Yes.
will really help unpack this because it's such a pertinent issue for us today. I have a question from Dr. Steve Perdue, and I'm going to invite Dr. Steve to ask you this question. Steve?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Wong, for the thought-provoking and really excellent presentation. My question is regarding the moral vision that you have tried to describe here and the New Testament. So the New Testament, as you know, has this dynamic of responding to the perception that Christianity might be undermining the social fabric. And that connects with how we observed in the first part of your talk about how there has been a decline in intact families along with the growth of Christianity, whether those are correlated or not. So I guess my observation is the New Testament sometimes seems to encourage Christians to kind of keep their heads down and live a quiet life and go along with social norms to avoid causing trouble, maybe like the pastoral epistles, and sometimes encourages rejection or at least a subtle undermining of those social norms, such as when Philemon is encouraged to receive Onesimus back as a brother. Which of those is closer to the type of moral imagination that you're trying to propose? Or is that a false way of framing the choice?
Well, I would respond to this question this way. I think Christianity transforms instead of destroy or abandon. So, well, I actually had a struggle when I was kind of thinking about Jesus saying that in the resurrection, there will be no marriage, right? So is Jesus destroying the family and marriage? Initially I thought, yeah, well, maybe he was doing that. And that when we think of it, leading down to the line would be, wow, so remaining single is a much better vocation, right? So we would go down the Catholic side of things. But later on, I read the Bible again, I say, well, wait a minute. Jesus will not abolish marriage in the resurrection because marriage will be transformed into himself and his bride, which is the church. So my view is that Christianity always transforms instead of abandon, right? So I use the language of family will be transformed. And the transformation will be from blood and kinship and vows and marriage, inclusive family, from an exclusive family to an inclusive family of the church. So it will be a transformation from the blood to the water. But before Christ comes again, we still have death, we still have birth, we still have blood relationship. So I would say this is an eschatological view, saying that now we still have marriage between men and women, we still have that kind of birth by blood. But the church is here, always reminds us that what we do here is penultimate. It is not ultimate. And so under this kind of eschatology, I would say both marriage, blood marriage, giving birth, and remaining single, both exclusive family and inclusive church, I mean, I would say they are equally important nowadays. Although our what we look forward, the ultimate fulfillment of humanity is actually in New Jerusalem, where Jesus said that we will not be marrying or giving in marriage. So this is how I kind of like consider the issue. So my view is actually transformation instead of abandoning. But frankly, I sometimes in some details, I do have struggled in between how to express that. I'm still on the journey of like thinking through the issue. So this is my way of approaching the what you call the family norm. Yes, I mean, God is saying that He creates the world in good order, and family is really a good order, orderly community where people can get married, be raised, and have stability to grow up and things like that. It is really good. But on the other hand, we don't idolize the family because that's not our ultimate goal. So I would put it that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your good question, wonderful question. Yeah.
Here is another question, and we're going to move a bit from, let's say, the Chinese culture, but I think a lot of our students are ministering in other cultures, and they do have this question. This comes from Abraham Cherian. What practical things should a new theology graduate do in order to eradicate or at least discourage polygamy or polyandry in their village or congregation where he or she is ministering?
Well, I would say, first ask the question, why polygamy? Or what was the term? Polyandry.
Yeah.
Why? I would say all cultures, there are some practical needs that polygamy or polyandry comes about. There must be some practical need, right? Say, for example, my investigation of the Old Testament, because apparently, polygamy was allowed in the Old Testament time. And one reason I give is that they put so much emphasis on having children, right, for the Old Testament people, because they wanted to inherit their name, inherit the property. And the other reason is that they know that their Messiah would comes through birth, right? So they must keep on having children. Otherwise, the Messiah won't come, right? So their salvation is actually in their descendants. So that's a very important reason why they want children. And the problem with that is if you only have one wife And if the wife doesn't give you a son, then it becomes reasonable to have more than one wife so that you can have a son, right? So that is the reason why polygamy or, well, you have to look at why the reason comes about. And for Christianity, it gives an answer to the question. It gives another way out. So for Christianity, for Christ to come, it actually addresses the concern of the Old Testament Jews. First of all, the Messiah has already arrived. So you don't need to have children to be saved, right? And then, and for your inheritance, right? For the Old Testament, inheritance was in land. But for New Testament, our inheritance is actually from the Spirit. For the Old Testament time, the family, your blood family provides for you economically. In the New Testament time, the church actually cares for the widow. Yeah. So you have to look at why that culture comes about. There's a reason behind, although we oppose polygamy, we oppose polyandry, but if you just oppose it, people would say, wow, we depend on that morality to survive. And what's the replacement? And I always think that Christianity offers a transformation, a way of transformation, another way to satisfy all those needs, but in a godly way. So I would encourage people or graduates to look into that and see how Christianity can fulfill the need of the people. So I will approach the question that way.
Thank you. That was really wise. We have a question from Dr. Nativity Petla, and I'm going to invite her to pose the question to you. Dr. Nativity Petla.
Hello.
You can unmute yourself, Nativity.
I think so, yeah.
So, Dr. Wong, when
Hello.
you mentioned the study on children from intact families doing better in school and other areas in life, is that a study conducted in the US, or is that also true in the Chinese or Asian context in general? And if so, how can the church as the household of God or a surrogate family foster that spirit or concept of intact family?
Right. It was done in the USA. And I am not 100% sure, but my guess is that it is not just for USA. It is more like the reason is that, well, I would say for all cultures, the biological parents caring for their children, it's the best arrangement. That's what I agree, because you see that even in the Bible, they say that for efficient, parents, you should love your children, and it's assumed to be their biological children. So I would imagine this is perhaps the best way. But having said that, it doesn't mean that for all particular family, it is true. I would say sometimes we know that parents can be abusive, neglecting, and it may be better for a child to be cared for in a foster family or even the church. It might be better. So I would imagine that the ideal scenario, it's like loving biological parents, stable family, loving family. That's the ideal. But the church, because we are also called a household, we are also called God's family. And so that's why I use the term surrogate family. So in reality, the church is not preferred over biological family, but it can serve as a function. But on the other hand, is that a more theological way of answering the question is that the blood family, of course, the biological family can care for their children better, but at the same time, the biological family has the problem of having family member too exclusive, so close in. So we always love our family, But if we only love our family, we forget loving people outside of the family, right? So the church always has a kind of gives us attention that we not just care for our own children. In the church, we also have to care for our children of other church members, right? So it's like the church always reminds us that we don't just close in on our family, although God gives us our own children to care for. And I like to use the image or the moral imagination of the neighbor. You know, God asks you to care for your closest neighbor, spend the most time to spend the most effort, most care given to the closest neighbor. And I would say that your own children are your closest neighbor, so they are your first priority. But doesn't mean that you don't care for people who are not as close. So the image gives us a way out of the situation where we have children who are not really cared for by their children, or they are kind of orphaned. So the church should become the surrogate family of those children. So I think I would like to answer your question this way. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Jimmy Chan.
Yeah.
How may the traditional understanding from Paul's letter to the Ephesians 5:22-23, wives submit to your husbands, as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he's the savior, be transformed such that there is more and equal status.
This is a very good question. I tried to answer that when I was doing my PhD. I really struggled with this, but I come to this. You know, some people say that this household code is patriarchal. Oh, so submit to your husband and things like that. But when I look at the whole epistle or of the Ephesians, the whole book, Paul, the whole letter, actually in the first part, Paul says that we are Christians and we should live a transformed life. So Paul is not giving the household code as some return to patriarchy. So Paul is actually saying that transformed Christian should love your wife and submit to your husband. But when we go into the detail, I don't think I have enough time to do that, but Paul is actually talking about mutual submission and mutual love between the husband and wife. Say, for example, in chapter 5, verse 21, Paul is saying that mutual submission, and then talk about submission of the wife. So my belief is that Ephesian household code in itself is a subversion of the patriarchal culture at Paul's time. So this is how I read Ephesians. And without going to too much detail, because we don't really have much time, so I actually did a lot of work in my PhD thesis, which is the book that Theresa mentioned. Is it's called Beginning from Man and Woman, Witnessing Christ's Love in the Family. I spent a whole chapter trying to interpret the household code, the Ephesian household code, and in a kind of like it's not totally Western egalitarian way, but also getting away from the patriarchy. But so I don't think I can spend too much time on that, but I did do a little work on that. Yeah.
This is such a rich discussion and an ongoing one. I have only one last question because we are running out of time. And the question is this: how do you think we can redeem our respective family cultures in light of the scriptures without totally destroying the uniqueness of our cultures? Okay. What are some of the possible tensions when we do this?
Yes. Yeah, so I think that all cultures arise for reasons, just like before when I answered the other question. And I'm an ethicist. So what I think is that people make decisions based on some important value, some goods, right? And so I'm also Augustinian in a way that people don't desire evil. So sin is actually a wrong way of desiring the good. You see what I'm saying? So people always desire the good, but people sin because they achieve the good in evil ways, right? So all cultures happen for good reasons, right? But when people, when some culture is developed, people use evil ways to achieve good ends, right? So I would say, and then for all Asian culture, Chinese, Korean, Indonesian, Philippines, their culture are actually aiming for some good things. But for Christians, we have to discern how are they fallen. How did people, you know, what was wrong when people were striving for the good? So we will have different expressions of the family. We can have different cultures, but all cultures need to be transformed. And the way to transform is through the Bible and through theology. So I think that is a concept. But how to do it, I think it would, you know, take a lot of discussion, and we will have to look into concrete cultures to answer that question. But my way of thinking is that, you know, all cultures aim at some good, but, you know, not everything is good. We have to look into each particular culture to really answer the question. So.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard Wong. You know, what I really love about this is how you've introduced the textures into these areas, you know, and so it's all multi-layered, it's all textual, it textures, it's nuanced, it's got layers that we've got to peel back, we've got to try to understand why these issues are happening, and I think that really encourages us to keep on thinking and pursuing these issues. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass this time to Dr. Theresa Lua.
Dr. Bernard Wong, for your excellent presentation, and thank you everyone for your engagement. Now, we would like to say goodbye to those who are joining us in FB Live, because we are going into our breakout rooms. Now, for those in the Zoom, please see the chat box for the link to the breakout rooms. You have to click that link to be able to join the breakout room. So if ever that you have not seen that, please go to the chat box. It's just posted. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, especially those in the FB Live, because we have to say goodbye to you now. We will be going into a small group discussion so that we can share our insights, ask more questions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Sooi also, for facilitating the Q&A, and see you in the breakout room.